Hello, I'm Robin Vincent and welcome to the Molten Music Monthly NAMM Show Special. Whoosh! Well, that was NAMM for another year. It's like the music technology equivalent of a Jackson Pollock. We were splattered by gear and news and products and lights and noise and bleeping sounds. How on earth can we know what was good? Well, never fear, because I'm here and I'm going to whiz you through what I thought was interesting from this year's show. And there was so much of it. I've got a whacking great big list of stuff to get through. Most of the video clips which will appear around me are probably from Analog Zone and also Perfect Circuit Audio, both of whom did great work at the show, producing some awesome videos about the gear and also some great demonstrations of what they were doing. And after you've been through my behemoth of a roundup, you should go and check out their channels to soak up in all the detail of the products that interested you. Links in the description. So without any further ado, let's start with the two big ones who kind of prematurely blew all their press before the show actually began. And that was Korg and Arturia. What an awesome looking synthesizer. I mean, it's all like proper and grown up and stuff. It looks like the real deal. It looks like something that Dave Smith Instruments or Oberheim would do. It looks like a Prophet. But this is the Korg Prologue. I mean, the Prologue has everything you'd want from a full-size, proper, put on a stand. Look at that, isn't that gorgeous, type synthesizer. It's a polyphonic analog synthesizer. It has two versions. There's a 49-keyed 8-voice version and then a 61-keyed, slightly bigger, 16-voice version. It has 3 oscillators, one of which is a special one. It's called a multi-engine oscillator, and it can be a noise, it can be wavetables, it can be variable phase, FM, whatever that is. And it can also be a user oscillator, because Korg have done something quite remarkable in that they're releasing a software developers kit for it to allow people to create and develop their own oscillators that can then sit in there as the third oscillator in this synthesizer. If you're the sort of person who's into that kind of software programming, then that's flipping phenomenal. Otherwise, there's a whole bunch of digital effects. There's an analog signal path, there's the filters, envelopes, LFOs, all the usual stuff you will find. And there's also a user modulator section which can be similarly programmed using the SDK to add your own form of modulation in there, which again is very, very interesting. There's also that lovely little oscilloscope screen, an arpeggiator, and the 16-voice one even has a built-in sort of master compressor section with a little VU meter. Lovely. All of this, and you can run actually 2 programs at once. I think it looks fabulous. It's a lot better laid out than the MiniLog. I always thought the MiniLog looked just a little bit weird, a little bit strange, unbalanced, whereas this has a much better overall layout, I think. Loving the wooden cheeks, loving the whole look about it. I think, personally, that Korg have just knocked it out of the park with this one. I know there's been some rumblings about, oh yeah, but then why wouldn't you get a Prophet or something along those lines? And that's fair enough, they're good comparisons. But from what I've seen and what I'm hearing, I think the Prologue is phenomenal. The 8-voice Prologue is $1,500, the 16-voice is $2,000. So that's, yeah, serious money for I guess, a serious synthesizer. Arturia gave us a bumper bundle of 3 related Brute products. First of all, there was the MiniBrute 2. This is the successor to the original little MiniBrute monosynth, and this has been reworked and re-engineered and turned into this rather lovely, versatile, capable and comprehensive mini monosynth. It looks great. I mean, it's all very SH101 with the sliders and the bits and pieces, and you've got, you know, your oscillators, your filters, all the usual sort of sections you expect to find on a synth, including their Steiner Parker filter and also the Brute knob, which brings in added, I don't know, overtones, overdrive, distortion. It just makes it angrier, which is no bad thing. One remarkable feature is that all the waveforms are always present. So you've got this waveform mixer, so you can mix them all together, as opposed to switching between waveforms, as is often the case on synthesizers. You also have 2 envelopes, one of which is a simple AD looping envelope. You know, the sort of cycling that you would get on a maths. And that, I think, is pretty awesome. I like that. I like the inclusion of that. That pleases me greatly. It has a 25-note keyboard with velocity and aftertouch and a step sequencer, all built in to the unit. So there's a lot to like in this little synth. And the look is much improved. The wooden edges, little touches like that, move it from the sort of plasticky look of the original MiniBrute into something that is more likely to appear to hold its own. And then the MiniBrute 2S arrived, which was get rid of the keyboard because we don't really need that and stuff in a bunch of pads and knobs to make it more of a sequencer focused synthesizer. And that, I think, is a really nice idea, because not everyone plays, not everyone wants to play notes like that. Some people are far more interested in purely the sequencing and the rhythmic nature of it. And the 2S does that. It just feeds that to you so you can play and compose and get it making noises so you can then mess with all the knobs. That's a great idea. I really like that. And then what I haven't mentioned is on the right-hand side of the synth, as seems to be the fashion these days, is this lovely patch bay, a huge patch bay. There's 48 patch sockets to allow you to route out into Eurorack or other bits of modular gear and back in. And that offers such a great amount of versatility in that it can sit in with a more modular system and be completely at home and usable. And that brings us rather neatly onto the third thing, which they're calling the RackBrute. Now, the RackBrute is just a case. It's a case for Eurorack, but in some form of innovative design, they've built it to fit with the MiniBrute. So the MiniBrute has these holes in the side that the case then latches into or screws into or combines with to form this kind of modular rig where you have the base of it as your MiniBrute, and then coming out of that at the top is a lovely sort of 3U rack of Eurorack or 6U rack of Eurorack. Or, you don't actually have to have the MiniBrute at all. You can just use it as a sort of a performance case that has this lovely rake to it, and it's sitting up there and allows you to patch everything into your MiniBrute. It's brilliant. I mean, it's a great piece of design to design your little mini synth and then have it completely at home within a Eurorack environment because you've built the case to make that happen. Phenomenal. There's always something which is not quite right. It has a module for the power supply. If you're designing and building a case that includes a power supply, there is absolutely no reason to use up HP with a power supply module. It doesn't need to be there. It could have been integrated anywhere else into the case. You could put a switch round the back, for heaven's sake. It seems such a weird waste of HP. And that for me is just the slight miss from the whole Arturia idea, because the other reason why it just seems weird is that the synthesizer in the MiniBrute seems perfectly sized to drop into the Eurorack section, to drop into 3U of Eurorack. It should just pull straight out and drop straight into there, but it can't because of that bleeding power supply module. But I don't want to get distracted into that because that's just, it works. Does it work? I don't know. The main point is that it's just a brilliant combination, and it really does invite people into the Eurorack experience because you can buy a synthesizer with which you're familiar and understand all of that, and then you can start adding little modules to it and have it brilliantly integrated. But with all this modular stuff, why didn't they release any modules? I don't know. Again, they must be thinking about that. They must have considered it. I mean, maybe Superbooth will see the whole MiniBrute taken apart and stuck into individual modules. It would be interesting to have a larger manufacturer start producing interesting modules. That could really get interesting. Or cheaper, perhaps, which is always something. So, sticking with synthesizers then, what else was at the show? Well, we finally got a proper look at the Waldorf Quantum. This has been knocking around for about a year, and then they seem to show it, sort of. This is a prototype, it's sort of kind of working, we're not going to show you very much, and then it disappears for like an entire year without any more updates on it. But this time around, it appears to be poised for release if it's not released already, which means it must finally be ready. It's a hybrid synthesizer. It means it's analog and digital, and it has 3 very interesting oscillators, which can be regular, boring oscillators. They could be wavetable, they could be granular, or they could act as a resonator. I mean, it looks amazing with that large display in the middle that's shining out all this moving and animated information. You've got individual LEDs on all of the knobs which show knob position and value position, which is something we only tend to find in kind of really expensive gear, and this is no cheap synthesizer. Apparently they've worked really hard on the workflow, how well the screen and the controls work together, because that's really what comes down to it, because every synthesizer is capable of producing a billion sounds. But what makes it a classic is how easy it is to extract sound from it, how easy it is to tweak and to start building your own sounds, because that is so often the barrier to a synthesizer being any good. And something which has a large screen like that and slightly mystical oscillators or forms of synthesis going on is always going to start to feel complex and difficult. And so to hear that they've been spending a lot of time working on how that flow works is very encouraging. So at the moment, the sound demos I've been hearing are fabulous. I mean, it looks complicated, but it also looks inviting. And it's a lot of money at about 3.5 grand. Waldorf also had a string machine vocoder knocking around that I couldn't be less interested in. Now this is a cool little thing, and also much smaller than I initially thought. It's kind of more like the size of an O-Coast. Whereas in the first sort of bits of video that I saw, it seemed more like a Dreadbox box. But I am loving the black and I'm loving the blue LEDs on everything. That just looks superb. So the Microvolt 3900, it's a desktop analog mono synth, which is full to the brim of their own sort of favorite circuits. And what I like about it is that it just seems to have slightly different and quirky stuff in it. I mean, first of all, along with blending the waveforms, you can also fold the waveforms, which is going to bring in all sorts of interesting harmonics. And there's even a halfway rectifier switch on the sine wave. The filter is binary state, which I guess means it has 2 states, which they are calling butter and grime, which is quite nice. The VCA is also a low pass gate, and so it's capable of producing those sort of plucked sounds. The bottom half of the Microvolt is all about modulation. You have a regular ADSR, but you also have a function generator which can cycle. So again, it's a bit of sort of maths being pulled out and stuck in there to create something interesting, some movement, something different going on that you don't usually expect to find. It also has a dual LFO and a sample and hold function. If anything, it's a little bit small, and those knobs look like they do get a little bit weeny, and it could have done with just being finished off with a delay or something like that stuck at the end. It's got a full-on patch bay over on the right, as everything does. And of course you can patch it wherever you like, into Modular, back out again, or into itself, or reroute stuff from the inside and outside, but it will also play completely happily on its own. It has 6 curious white buttons, sort of over on the left, that no one seems to talk about, but it does seem to be labelled MIDI stroke arpeggiator, so I have to assume it has an arpeggiator built in. But there was no sign of a sequencer. It should cost just over $600 and will be available in April. With still no sign of the OPZ, we're going to have to make do with a couple of new pocket operators. These are always fun and fruity and such like, and this time it's all about sampling. These join with the Tonic from last year in what they're calling the Metal series, for no suitably explored reason. The PO33KO is a micro sampler, sample stuff in, 8 lots of melodic samples, 8 lots of drum samples. Why you can't use one in the other, I have no idea, but apparently that's what it is. And then you can sequence it and mess it about and make fart noises and stuff, and fill up the whole 40 seconds full of gibberish. The PO35, or Speak, is designed more as a vocal synthesizer, a vocal changer, if you like. You stick your voice in it and it makes your voice sound funny. But this has 120 seconds of sampling time and all the usual effects and messing about. I mean, it's all such fun. I have no idea what happened to PO34, but these are going to be 79 quid and always a winner for people who like calculator-sized noise-making machines. I've spoken about this before, and I'm going to speak about it again because it's the first time that the Deckard's Dream had made it outside of Japan and was on show at NAMM with the 1U expander for the first time ever, and no one seemed to care. I could not find a demo of that anywhere or anyone talking about the expander, what it did, how it achieved anything or improved anything, and it was supposed to carry a lot of CV inputs and outputs for the rig as well as effects and bits and pieces, and it would have been really interesting to see that wired up and see how that works. But no one seemed to care. I mean, maybe it's because Yamaha had an actual CS80 on display and on demo on their stand, along with absolutely nothing else of any interest whatsoever. So maybe we didn't need to play with a synthesizer inspired by the CS80. I don't know, I just want to know more about it. It's about time we got to the guts of it. I want to see what it's about. I want to hear far more from the internals of that machine, just to get a better feel for what it's capable of. Now, this was first shown last year along with two other boxes that sort of have all failed to materialize, but the one that Malekko worked on for the past year is called the Manther. And for some reason it's been called a groove box, and I don't really know why that is, because that's not what it is. It's a monosynth. It's a synthesizer in an SH-101 sort of styly, where you've got your monosynth section and your sequencer section. There's nothing really sort of dramatic or innovative in that. It's just a good sounding desktop synth from a company who makes interesting and sort of thundering stuff. Now, the Malekko Manther is based upon the Curtis SEM 3340 chip, which seems to be the most popular chip around at the moment. It's the chip that's responsible for the VCO in lots of classic synthesizers, like the Prophet 5, like the SH-101, like an Oberheim, loads. Jupiter 6, I believe, had this chip inside, and that's where those classic sounds come from. And those have been recreated, reissued, rebuilt, whatever. They've made more of them, and they are appearing all over the shop. And so the Manther is based upon this reissued 3340 integrated circuit, which is great. I guess it means you can guarantee that it's going to have a certain sort of sound to it. And then the rest of the synthesis on there, you know, the LFO, the envelope, the filter, is all kind of relatively standard stuff. But perhaps it's the sequencer that gives it a slight edge. I mean, it's 64 steps of sequencing, which is unusual, on this lovely layout of lit up buttons on the bottom. And apparently it has 64 preset slots in which to save your patterns, and then you can go from one pattern to another or set up chains of patterns and create songs and all that sort of stuff, which is really very interesting. Not strictly at NAMM themselves, but it was announced at the same time, which is the Behringer Neutron. Oh yes, we've spent all our time worrying about and criticizing or celebrating their production of clones, or their schedule of cloned synthesizers, that we sort of missed the idea that Behringer could actually design and build their own synths. And why not? Why not do that? In fact, personally, I sort of prefer that. I mean, I know it's fabulous to have access to old vintage synths because they were good, because they're old or something, but why not use all of that technology, all these components they've put together, all their production and expertise that Behringer have acquired? Why not do something new and interesting? And that's what they've done. So they've just thrown this Neutron out there. It's probably a monosynth, I imagine. Seems to have a couple of oscillators of wave mixing and all the usual bits and pieces. And again, wham, that great big patch bay on the right hand side, because that's the law, that's the rules. It has to be over there for some reason. I just really like the patch points to be in amongst the knobs. I like that, I prefer that. But then that's just me. It's wonderfully resplendent in red and is just kind of fruity. Again, it's based on that SEM 3340 chip, and so is going to have that kind of meaty sound that we're all expecting, that we're all familiar with from the SH-101, that we're all familiar with the Prophet 5, etc, etc. And so with a bit of luck, Behringer have created a decent desktop monosynth, which is going to be at a great price with a great sound that everyone can get behind. That'd be nice. Now, I'm really sorry about this, but Elektron they just leave me cold. These little black boxes covered with sort of nondescript knobs and a bunch of buttons, they just elicit nothing from me. They don't seem to touch on anything. My response to them is one of kind of mild sort of boredom. They don't excite me, but I don't hate them. I just can't find an opinion anywhere in my head, in my soul. Nothing really resonates with them. They're just sort of these black boxes that make beats and stuff. And I'm sorry, because I know people love them. People worship Elektron and everything that they make. And I can't seem to summon up the energy to engage with that. But anyway, they had a new box. It's called the Digitone, and it's an FM synthesizer, 4-operator FM synth. Great, FM synth. Again, that's something that some people really love. I mean, I loved FM synths back in the 80s. I had a DX100, it was my first synthesizer, and I really got into the guts of that thing. But I was quite happy to leave that kind of synthesis behind. But apparently many people love it and many people want it, and so here you are. Here is an unnecessarily complex form of synthesis from the 1980s for you, for sequencing and this black box beat making stuff. It's awesome. Go check it out if that's your thing. I'm sure it's fabulous. I'm sure it's $780 worth of fabulousness. So rounding off the synths and sort of crossing over into Eurorack is the Radikal Technologies Delta SEP-A, something like that, SEP-A. I think it's based on some kind of astrological star system naming convention. But what we have here is a classic Eurorack voice. It has everything. I mean, there's quite a lot of stuff packed in here, along with your usual sort of synthesizer bits. What's interesting about it is the swarm oscillator. It's this oscillator which can create 8 copies of itself or something into clouds and bursts of stuff. I mean, it's paraphonic, which means everything goes down the same signal chain, so it's not as if it's polyphonic. You can't play chords, but you can create with these 8 oscillators sort of detuned chords that then play as part of that. Does that make any sense? So you're not playing it with lots of fingers, you are tuning these oscillators to different notes and can generate chords and clusters of sound in that kind of way. It can store patches and it can crossfade and sort of morph between them, which is really very interesting. It has an LFO with 5 waveforms, and it has a bunch of really quite cool effects at the other end. And I like the fact that the patch points are all scattered amongst the knobs and the different sections, because then I know where I'm going to and where I'm going from, and it all seems to make sense with patch cables. This big thing, patch bay thing over on the right, you never know what's plugged into what. Well, you do, I suppose, but you don't at a glance. It's just a going somewhere else. Whereas, you know, here's my oscillator, I want to take something from that, plug it in over there, plug that LFO, I want to plug it into that. That just works for me far more than a patch bay. So that's very cool. The Delta SEP-A seems to be a kind of a massive synth voice. It certainly takes up a lot of room in your rack, although they are also releasing a desktop version, I believe, and that perhaps might be better suited. I kind of like it in its own thing rather than filling up a hole in your rack like my Mother 32 does. I'm still not 100% happy about that being there. And these sorts of large synth voices, I have the same feeling about all of those really, whether they should be in the rack or whether they're better on a desktop. I don't know. I guess if you can do both, then you can take your choice. The Delta SEP-A is going to cost about $1,000, so it's a serious piece of kit. Just before we move on, I can bring you the news that Jacob Brashear was spotted at NAMM. Now, he was the guy that last year brought along this Oberheim sort of clone or reimagining. It was this box called the Relic 6, and it wasn't discovered, so it seemed, until the Sunday, and everyone went, what's this? He says, oh, it's just a little box I made that makes these nice sort of Oberheim sounds, and it sounded fantastic. And everyone went, oh my god, look at this thing. How old are you? You're 18, you've built this? That's amazing, this is going to be huge, this is fantastic. And then sort of a week after the show, bam, it all disappeared. It all just went. The website was unchanged, social media was unchanged, their 3 followers on Twitter didn't say anything. It just all seemed to vanish. I even looked into it over Christmas when I was putting together my Whatever Happened To article for Gear News, and I got no response from them then. And so I just kind of assumed the whole thing was either dead and he'd gone back to school or something, or it had been bought out by someone like Behringer who had just sort of shut it down or had put it on the back burner till later. But no, apparently not. He issued a statement saying that, oh no, we're still working on it. We just kind of forgot to update the website or tell anybody, but we've made it so much better now. We've been talking to so many people because of the interest that they got, and they are in the process of making a much better product. That's very interesting. No clue as to when or where we'll ever see it, but he said he was knocking around at NAMM just to sort of reassure people that they are still alive and they are still working on it, and there is great things to come. He also took a little bit of a swipe, sort of at Behringer, really, or about the idea of people remanufacturing old dead chips. And his sort of attitude was that it's not really in the chips, it's in the way the synthesizer is put together, it's in the architecture. And you don't have to have an old reissue chip in order to capture a fantastic sound. So with all these SEM 3340s knocking around, that's a very interesting thing to say. But then he's only a kid, so, you know, what does he know? Right, Eurorack. Okay, this was a huge thing. Everybody had a whole load of modules to show you. And it was really great seeing sort of the manufacturers entering into the spirit of NAMM a bit more, rather than just being, you know, a little rack on a table as part of a larger booth. They were all bringing great big banners and posters, and they were creating a bit of a vibe and really sort of going for it, which I think is great. It sort of demonstrates the evolution of Eurorack from being this kind of second-class afterthought part of NAMM into really sort of stamping their identity on it. And I thought that was really very cool. Now, rather than spending an hour or two on this, I'm going to pick out 5 things or 5 manufacturers who did particularly interesting things, and then I'll just mention everything else so that we can then move on. Otherwise, we'll be here forever. So here's what I thought was just particularly cool from the Eurorack side of things. What a beautiful module. Just stunning. I mean, Strymon usually make guitar pedals, but they've found that electronic musicians are often using their pedals as part of their larger rig. So you'll be routing out of Eurorack and through something like the Blue Sky Reverb or the El Capistan delay modulator kind of thing. So they thought, well, as people are using it, why don't we give them a proper box with the proper levels and inputs and outputs and possibilities that they need to really, really work with it. Fabulous idea, because Strymon seemed to make really good stuff. And the guy, Mr. Strymon, whoever it is who's in charge, he just seems really very cool and very into what he's doing, and and the way he comes across in these videos as he's describing his product just sounds like this is his whole heart is in this. And you get a sense of that, I think, just looking at the module and hearing what it's doing. So it's called the Magneto, which is not a particularly great name, but it's a 4-head tape delay looper phrase sampler thingy. So at a basic level, it's a good old sort of fattening tape delay where you get these fantastically wonderful movements of sound and delay and echoes going on and round and back and stuff. They talk about it being an interstellar space machine, and that's really where I see it taking its role within my rack, is just to take you off to different delayed places in space and time, and then coming back and then looping that and then doing something else with it. Just a beautiful, beautiful module making an awesome sound. And it also, you know, loops and samples and does weird stuff, and, you know, does, I don't know, all sorts. You just need to go and see all of the videos. Go and check all of them out to see what all of it does. It's quite a wide module, but it's beautifully designed and laid out. It just looks like an absolute joy to use. I would buy another row in order to fit that in if I could ever afford one. And it's just an echo. Well, you know, I like a good delay. Oh yes. QuBit brought along 3 fascinating modules that are just a little bit different, a little bit strange, a little bit interesting. And they are Synapse, the Scanned Organic Wavetable VCO, and Nebulae, or rather Nebulae 2. Synapse is a crossfading switch, which doesn't sound particularly interesting, but what you essentially do is you can jam in 8 sound sources into the top, and then they mix into pairs. So you have a crossfade knob between pairs mixing into 4 channels. Those then 4 channels feed to 4 outputs plus 3 sort of mix outputs, and then you can modulate it and control it to route all sorts of things to different places. So as you step through it, you can have, you know, channel 1 and 2 mix and crossfading between each other, coming in of output 1 and then output 4, then output 3, and moving about. So you get this movement, this animation, this way of creating textures from all sorts of sound sources coming in. It gets mixed and modulated together and farted around different places within your Eurorack. very, very interesting. There's also a lot of probability involved in what outputs are being used at what time. And it has the ability to store patches and then morph and modulate between them. Really very interesting. I was quite fascinated by what it was doing, and how then my brain went off saying, oh yeah, but maybe I could do this, do this. Yeah, very, very interesting. The scanned organic wavetable oscillator was, yeah, interesting, but I wasn't quite so engaged with it perhaps. The idea is that it takes the notion of a string held in space, which is moving and oscillating or vibrating very, very slowly. And then that vibration is sort of scanned, which enables you to pick up some kind of oscillation which is in the audible range or something. And you change the texture or material within that string, and that changes the sort of sound and waveforms it can produce. It's a bit like physical modelling, but it seems to be something that isn't that. It's something else. And the way they talk about it, it makes it sound extremely important and extremely processor sort of intensive. It's never been possible before. And now we are experiencing these new sounds. And then out the other end, you kind of get this, you get that Eurorack sound of waveforms being crushed and manipulated and pulled apart. It's that thing where, you know, the manufacturer's there at the show talking about it, saying about how this is just going to change the world. It's a game-changing new form of synthesis, and then you just get this out the other end. I mean, it happens a lot. So the Nebula or Nebular version 2, on the other hand, was pretty awesome. This is something they've done in the past, which then got sort of discontinued, and they're now bringing it back in with a new reworked version. And essentially it's a granular sampler. So you stick a little card in the front with a bunch of samples on, and you mess them about. It sort of, I don't know, it sort of appeared to me to be a bit like a sort of a well-behaved Morphogenie. I mean, the Make Noise Morphogenie does all this crazy stuff with samples, whereas a Nebula seems to do less crazy, more intentional, more sort of creative and softer and more applied usage, so you could really create some fascinating textures and environments with what it was doing, rather than sort of funkiness, which is what the Morphogenie seems to be really good at. So the Nebula looks like the sort of module you could just have a whole load of fun just messing with. I mean, all the QuBit stuff now is just looking fantastic. I love the fact they've moved to black. I think the case that they had with all of their black fronted stuff in it just looked fantastic. A very beautiful Eurorack with some very, very interesting things. I mean, not all of their modules, I find, really hit the mark, but they have a handful that do. And when they do get it right, I think they're some of the best modules out there. And I don't have any of them. I'd really like to try them out. I think the reason I don't have any is that they tend to be wide. You tend to have to give up a lot of HP for them, which, you know, is always on balance. I'll go for something smaller often. Although, you know, I have a Clouds that I don't know that I like very much. I think a QuBit module could fit in there really quite nicely. So QuBit, if you're out there, feel free to send me one to try. My interest in noise engineering is growing all the time after I got over the fact that they make silly names for things. I started to like them and enjoy what they do and enjoy their humor and their approach to stuff. I find very interesting. They had a fistful of stuff at the show this year, and the best amongst them was the Mimetic Digitalis, if I said that right. I have no idea. It's kind of a 16-step, two-dimensional sequencer, which means I don't really know. I mean, it's got 4 channels in there, 4 different channels of sequencing, 16 steps. It's got these 16 lights that go along. It has this ability to be triggered in all sorts of different ways, lots of trigger inputs for moving it on to the next step or the next bit or the next pattern or something. And it has this very cool shred button, which as you go along, you hit shred and it will randomize whatever step that you were on, which is an excellent way of creating quick patterns out of stuff. But there's a lot of randomness and lots of probability built into it. And it sounds like it could be a very sort of interesting way of mucking about with sequences and getting very creative. I don't particularly like the look, or rather I don't love the look, the way that the LEDs are kind of on a chunk over to the left. It just seems weirdly unbalanced somehow, which there are other modules which are kind of chaotic in their layout, don't seem to give that impression at all. But, you know, maybe that's just me. Vermona had some really simple and fabulously random based modules. The MeloDICEr is a sequencer which I've never seen before. It has all these sliders which you assume are steps in the sequence, but they're not. They actually represent different notes, notes of the musical scale. And as you push the slider up, then that note becomes more likely to sound within the sequence. So if you push something all the way up, it will always sound as the sequence rotates. And as you push other ones up, it sometimes will and sometimes won't. And it allows you to create the exact notes that you want, and yet gives it a very organic, a very human sort of way of playing. I found that quite fascinating. Annoyingly wide, but really, really fascinating. That appeals to me, and I'm not entirely sure why. I think at the moment I'm right sort of in the middle of working at sequencing, of trying to work out what I want from sequencing, what I want to happen, how I'm going to fit that into my ideas of making music. And that really appeals. I like the way of throwing those notes in there. It's kind of combining sequencing with quantizing, I suppose, with probability and randomness all kind of churned in. I don't know, it just really, really, really appeals. And they have this other module as well called Random Rhythm, which is similar in its randomness, but not in the way that it works. What you have is you have 4 channels of timing. So you have quarter notes, eighth notes, 16th notes, and triplets. And each one of those is on a slider, 4 sliders. And as you push the slider up, then that rhythm becomes more likely. So you could push, say, the 16ths all the way up to get this 16th going on. Then you could stick the 8ths up halfway and you get this occasional other tick coming in, or put the triplets up a little bit, and every now and again you'll get kind of a triplet sound coming through. It just seemed to be a genius way of creating rhythmic patterns with sort of organic feeling. Again, this sort of humanization of these rhythmic patterns to create them very, very quickly and easily within your Eurorack. And that is, again, something I'm really exploring at the moment, and that also greatly appealed to me. It comes in a dual format, so there's 2 of them in the single module, which perhaps is overkill. I quite like maybe just one of them would be enough, but then it depends how much percussion that you need. Maybe you need it to go into 2 sound sources. Maybe percussion is traditionally at least 2 sound sources. I don't know. Anyway, it was fascinating. I really liked it. But then they had this other thing that people seem to be ignoring or not quite understanding, and it was called a cross-point switch and virtual patch manager. Now, I don't really completely understand absolutely everything that's going on with it, but what I could gather from what I saw was that you stick 8 sound sources in one end, and then out the other end you stick 8 sort of processors or routes, if you like, through your Eurorack. So you could have one output going to a filter, another output going to a different filter, another one going through some effects, or another one going to a submix through something else. And then you patch the inputs to the outputs internally via CV. So you send it a control voltage, and that sets up the routing from this one to this one. So the idea is that you can completely patch any oscillator to any of these processor destinations and then save that as a patch. So you suddenly have the ability to save patches within Eurorack, to save exactly what it is your oscillator is connected to, and then change that, and then change it again, and then recall it and come back to where it was before without having to remember where everything was plugged into. So it could sit kind of in the center of your rack and control everything into and out of each other. And there's hundreds of combinations, 256 combinations of switch to switch from one to the other. So you could set that up and then switch it for the next song and switch it for the next song. It could be an awesome performance tool in the way that it memorizes your entire set. At least that's what I got out of it. Maybe I was missing something, maybe I was misinterpreting it, but that seemed to be what it did, and that to me seems phenomenal. I mean, all this stuff was very much at the prototype stage. They were all with handwritten front panels all over them, but that was a lot of interesting stuff coming from a company that I hadn't really looked at before. WMD was showing a little module called Fracture, which was based on the rather weird idea of wanting to generate the sound of applause. I mean, possibly they have sort of personal self-esteem issues. I'm not sure. But anyway, the Fracture generates particles from microsamples spun together in clouds. The result is kind of sort of noise-based percussion. It's kind of like a clap sound. They're looking for a clap sound that they wanted to kind of pull apart and reinvent. And they did that by sort of shooting it into space, splatting it into particles, putting those particles about with sort of tension and gravity, and then stuffing that through some kind of portal, presumably into the module. The result is kind of like applause, I suppose, in places, kind of like a shaker, but it has a lot of sort of versatility and ability to be manipulated into all kinds of different variations on that percussive clap sort of shaker theme. It's kind of a really interesting and complex noise maker with a ridiculous amount of versatility. There was just something about it that sort of really spoke to me. And of course, there was so much more than that. Let me just quickly go through the list of other stuff that was on offer. Dopefer released a whole load of polyphonic modules, a quad VCO, a VCA, a filter, all quad ones for 4 voices all running through each other. 4MS had the finished version of their spherical wavetable oscillator, which we have sort of seen before, but now it could finally be here. Vintage SynthLad had a SEM 3340 based synth voice and an interesting delayed envelope. 512 was showing the latest prototype of this long-awaited vector sequencer thingy. Mordax, the people who make that data oscilloscope that you see in everybody's videos, they had another module called the GXN granular module. And either it's just not very interesting, or the bloke doing the demo just didn't really have a grasp of it, because every video I've watched of it, it's just not been very interesting. SSF had a full voice in the Bantam and a 0-point VCO. Malekko, as I've spoken about before, but they had a Eurorack version of the Manther called the Manther Growl, which is exactly the same synth voice but without the sequencer. But they also had a bunch of new modules. They had a quad envelope and a quad LFO and a quad VCA. They also had a 4-channel drum synth, which I thought was really very handy. I like drums that have more than one sound in them. And they also had a ridiculously fun randomizer module. 2HP had hat, snare and kick. IntelliGel had the Morgasmatron, which I think is a dual sort of filter thing, a bit like the Korg Gasmagon, the Korg I don't know what it's called. And they had a new version of the Rubicon and the planar joystick thingy. Verbos had a very, very wide 8-tap digital delay. Fractals had a similarly wide filter bank thing. And lastly, I think Erica Synths were there with a whole big rig of all their new stuff, like the drum computer. They got a new drum line of modules. They've got a new black hole DSP. They got this weird resonator EQ thing, and the very interesting and yet to be fully sort of uncovered graphic VCO. All of it, you know, very, very awesome, but we'd kind of seen it all before, so I was looking for absolutely brand new stuff to highlight this year. Right, are we done yet? No, the last thing to talk about is the computer music side of things. There was a handful of stuff. It was just nowhere near like other years when it was all about doing it in the box, or doing it in the computer box, I should say, because nowadays we tend to be doing it in the Eurorack box. So doing it in a box is no longer necessarily just meaning software and computer. Well, at least for me. Or are you talking about, maybe you're talking about doing it in an Elektron box? I don't know, I wouldn't know or understand or feel anything about that either way. Let's start off with Pro Tools. Pro Tools is now Pro Tools 2018. They've decided that those version numbers that you stick on bits of software that are really helpful so that you know which version you're running and what you're doing, that's just a load of old nonsense. And what we really need to feel about our software is obsolescence. That's the important theme. That Pro Tools 2018, we know once we get into sort of Christmas time, we're going to be thinking, oh wow, my Pro Tools is out of date, man. Look, I'm running 2018 and 2019 is just around the corner. I'm going to have to upgrade. So Avid have decided that that's how we need to feel about our DAW, which is awesome. But that aside, it looks like a really interesting update. The thing that they have implemented ahead of anybody else is this sort of retrospective recording. Now, Ableton announced this with Ableton Live 10, but they haven't got around to actually producing the goods yet. And so the idea is that you're just sitting there playing stuff and you go, oh, well, that was brilliant, what I just played. What a shame that I wasn't in record and actually recording it. Well, Ableton Live and first Pro Tools is going to say, well, we have recorded it. We've been listening. As a DAW, I've been sitting here listening to your playing and I've recorded it anyway. And you can then go, oh, so I have recorded it and there it is. brilliant. Retrospective MIDI record is what they call it. Just need to have your track enabled and it will do all the recording behind the scenes and not tell you about it unless you ask. Another thing they have is track presets. You can now create an entire library and catalogue of track presets which contain effects chains or instruments or even MIDI and audio if you want. You can set up a track exactly how you want it to be and then save that and recall it anytime you like. It's a nice idea, it's a brilliant idea. It could save on your workflow, particularly if you're doing a lot of the same things time and time again. There's now a start collaboration button because Avid are very much into this online collaboration between studios and musicians. It's also a good way to sell subscriptions to their online servers, I suppose. So you're in the middle of a project and you go, wow, I wish I could get those vocals in for that singer in LA, and you can go bang, start collaboration, everything gets sucked up to the cloud or something. I don't know how dramatic it is or what you see on screen, but that probably just shuts your project down and then reopens it. But it's transferred everything up to the cloud where your collaborator can see it, can add something to it, and then you can bring it all back to your computer again to work on. I like the way that that's sort of fully integrated and doesn't require you to have that all set up beforehand. You can decide mid-project that you're going to start collaborating. That I think is a really nice thing. Lots of other improvements, you know, under the hood, the graphics, the colouring, the EQ in the mixer page, a whole stack of stuff, which makes you think that perhaps this perpetual license subscription thing is kind of working for Pro Tools. The other thing is that it was ready to download on the day. I've already got it. It's amazing to actually have something which is released and then it's there. Brilliant. And that's also actually something quite nice about the subscription service, is that I haven't had to sort of find the money and buy the upgrade. I've already upgraded because I'm already paying my yearly subscription. And that's quite good. I wasn't expecting that to be good, but that's quite nice. Also, similarly, Sibelius has got an upgrade, and they've also called that Sibelius 2018, so that, you know, people who compose can also feel obsolete. Roland announced that they are releasing software versions of the TR-808 and TR-909 drum machines. At last! I mean, everybody else has done emulations of them. Everybody else has released either sample-based or modelled versions of the 808 and 909 drum machine sounds, but finally Roland have actually got their act together and done it themselves. It's the real deal. Well, it's the real, sort of as real as it gets, emulated sort of analog circuit behavior type modelling deal that you're going to get. But of course, you know, the interface is perfect, the sounds are going to be as perfect as you can find. They're all wrapped up as part of the RolandCloud subscription. And the amount of stuff you're getting now on RolandCloud does seem to be making it more and more attractive. Just have to consider whether they are things I'm going to use enough to make it worthwhile having them. I mean, I imagine they're also going to be available to purchase as individual plugins, but there's no more information on that as yet. Antares Auto-Tune gets a new version. They're calling it Auto-Tune Pro in order to separate it from all those amateur idiots. It gets a reworked user interface, which is much simpler to use, a good graphical mode, and they've added things like key and scale detection, ARA support and integration, so it can work like MeloDICEr on a timeline. There's MIDI control, a classic mode, which makes it sound like Auto-Tune version 5. Apparently that's a feature request. And they've introduced Flex Tune technology in order to somehow capture the expressive gestures of the vocalist. There's a humanized function to work on the sort of the sound of sustained notes and all sorts of other bits and pieces stuffed in there. Talking of ARA or ARA, Celemony have introduced version 2, or are introducing version 2 very shortly, which just gives us better and more integration. It gives you multi-track editing, and they've also made the specification a little bit looser and easier so that more software can accommodate it. I mean, at the moment, apparently PreSonus Studio One, Reaper and also Logic are all supporting ARA 2. Another technology update was version 2 of NKS, the native control standard from Native Instruments. This is a protocol that enables their MIDI controller keyboards to map automatically to software virtual instruments. Now version 2 brings in support for effects as well. So it's not just instruments you can control, you can also control VST plugin effects. Exactly how that works, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, maybe it will be like the machine software that you can use with their NKS keyboards, which allows you to select and edit effects as well as instruments. I mean, maybe it will do that. Hopefully, it'll allow you to chain up effects with instruments and sort of use them and access them together. But we shall see. Criminally undercovered at the show was Cherry Audio's, terrible name, Voltage Modular, better name, which is a virtual Eurorack plugin, piece of software, whatever you like. It's a virtual Eurorack on your screen. Now this is obviously very much like Softube Modular or the VCV Rack. And so Voltage Modular has probably got its work cut out in order to carve in a little bit of market presence there. But it certainly looks very pretty, very colourful, very easy to get to grips with. I think the man said that it comes already with 40 modules and that you just drag them about and drop them around and plug things in, and it all just works brilliantly as any kind of Eurorack modular synthesizer would. I mean, that's great, but then kind of what else would you expect, really? I mean, Cherry Audio is a bunch of old industry veterans, people who have left Cakewalk since it fell apart, or Sonic Foundry, or BIOS, and Acoustica, I believe. So a bunch of old guys have got together to try to do something new, innovative and interesting. I mean, I imagine they've been working on this for quite a while, and so, you know, things like VCV Rack, which has come storming in, perhaps wasn't available when they started off with this project, but they've certainly got to make it special, I think, to make a mark. I mean, their idea, which is a very, very good one, is to offer it up as a development platform. The idea being that anyone could develop a module for Vintage Modular, which is exactly right. That's exactly what they should do. But that is also why VCV Rack has been so successful, because that's precisely what they've done. They've opened it up completely so that anyone can write for them. And they have hundreds of modules and hundreds of developers coming on board. I mean, what I think is going to be interesting is that on the one hand, you've got VCV Rack, which is very much enthusiast based, very much based in the community of enthusiasts and synthesizers and development people. And on the other side, you've got Vintage Modular that's based in the industry. You've got industry veterans who know the industry, who know people in the industry, who perhaps might be able to get some of the high-level programmers who make stuff for native or make stuff for Reactor or for software synthesizers or Rob Paben or all these other developers, that they might get access to them to bring them in to create modules for it. So you've kind of got this enthusiast versus industry insider competition thing going on. But one thing that Voltage Modular does have over VCV Rack at the moment, and that is that it's available as a plugin. It will run standalone, but it also can plug in directly within your DAW, so you have no problem as to where your audio is going or how you're going to capture that performance. VCV Rack at the moment doesn't have that. They're working on this kind of VST bridge idea of getting the sound sort of bridged from VCV Rack into your DAW, but it just sort of sounds messy and complicated, and that's not what you need. There's enough complexity within building synthesizers and patching stuff up. You don't need it in how you're getting the sound out of that software into another piece of software. So maybe at the moment that's the deal breaker. I don't know. I'd love to see more coverage on it though. I'd love to see more videos on it and what it's all about, and I'd also like to have a go very much Voltage Modular. That would be awesome. A quick update to our favourite DAW, Bitwig Studio, has made its way all the way to version 2.3, and it's brought with it a Phase 4 synthesizer. It's kind of a collision between FM and phase distortion synthesis. I don't know, it just creates a bunch of load more noise, I suspect. But some of the other enhancements to Bitwig include now making the device's view much bigger. So a number of their devices now have expanded views which fill up the whole screen and give you lots of animated detail and controls and displays on stuff, which is excellent. So it no longer just has to sit in that little conveyor belt across the bottom. They've introduced other cool stuff like time signatures, so you can change time signatures within your project, and they've upgraded all the time stretching algorithms in there as well. And they've introduced instrument stacking and instrument switching. So you can very quickly switch between instruments, like if you were playing live, without having to load one and unload another. So there's no sort of glitch or anything between them. You can switch instruments and all the reverb tails and the delays continue, and it's very smooth and interesting. So that's pretty cool. And then you can stack up instruments to layer up these enormous sort of soundscapes as well. All sounds good, onwards and upwards. Thank you, Bitwig. Now I've nearly frozen to death out here, but we are so nearly there. Two more things to talk about, and those are the only two audio interfaces that I could find at the show. The first one is the UAD Arrow. Now this is like their cheap and cheerful entry-level version of their Apollo interfaces. So it has a single Shark DSP processor in there to run the fabulous UAD plugins, but it's under $500. It's a little desktop box, and it's Thunderbolt 3. Now they're saying it's the world's first Thunderbolt 3 desktop audio interface. It might well be, I don't know, I can't think of any others. So there you go. It's also bus powered, so it can be powered purely off the Thunderbolt connection, which is quite good considering the technology that's inside. You do only get stereo in and out though. We do get a nice big fat knob on the top, which is always nice, but you can use their Unison software, which means you can apply their plugins directly to the inputs themselves. So whether you're going in with a microphone or whether you're going in with a guitar, you can run through all their wonderfully emulated old-fashioned vintage preamps and gear. It's a great thing. I mean, it's the cheapest way that I'm aware of that you can get hold of UAD plugins. I mean, it still has the same restrictions. You've only got one DSP chip, so you're not going to be able to run an entire huge mix with UAD plugins on every channel, but you will be able to use enough of them to make an impact and to really get some of that flavor, some of that emulated quality that UAD are famous for right within a little setup. The other box is the Audient ID44. I like to keep my eye on Audient because they make quite cool little audio interfaces. They've never quite been exactly what I wanted, but I've always sort of kept a lookout just in case if they make a few adjustments, they might just make the ideal interface for me. The ID44 isn't far off. It's the same really as their ID22 or whatever it was, their previous ones. Then it has the same high quality mic preamps that they take off their huge enormous consoles. So the quality is no problem. And you've got 4 analog inputs and 4 analog outputs. I guess that's the 4-4. But then it has another 16 channels on ADAT. Now why that interests me is that I could route ADAT into a little ADAT to CV module in my Eurorack and then start using Eurorack and control voltages backwards and forwards through Bitwig. That could be interesting. But either way, the ID44 is a tidy desktop unit. It's got JFET inputs for guitars. It has insert send and returns on the inputs. So you could route through hardware effects and hardware preamps and bits and pieces if you so wished. And then it has this little ID knob on the top which can take over control of any parameter in software that you leave your mouse on, which is brilliant. That's what the Surface Dial should do at the very least. But it's just a simple, great little feature. And at $699 for 20 in and 24 outputs, that's not too bad. Now I'm sure there's plenty more that I missed. I don't know, but this seems like enough. I think my voice is going, I'm frozen and cold, hungry now, and bored of the whole NAMM thing. So I think that's enough. I think those were the highlights, the things that really spoke to me. And that was pretty much everything. I mean, I thought it was a great year. I think there was so much more in there, so much more vibe. I mean, some of the problem I think perhaps is that a lot of the big releases were announced beforehand, which I think is a shame. I think it steals some of the thunder of the show because you want to get excited about the whole thing, whereas the Korg and the Arturia stuff had already come out, so you've lost that excitement edge already and you're already looking around for other things to find. But there was plenty to see, and there was plenty of stuff that, you know, I just don't think I need to talk about, like the ridiculously expensive DEC MIDI controller. There was a sneak peek of a new synthesizer from Black Corporation, which looks really interesting. There's the Alesis Wireless Vortex 2, IK Multimedia's Leslie plugin, or that enormous futuristic touchscreen Neumann synthesizer. But there's always more stuff. There's always more stuff, but I think I've given you enough. And the best thing of the show, I think, yeah, for me, was probably the Strymon Magneto. I think that's just a sublime and awesome bit of Eurorack. Right, coming along shortly, I have a review of the Roly little Seaboard squidgy keyboard. I've also just taken delivery of an Arturia audio fuse, which I'm going to be going through and doing a review of on Windows, because no one has really talked about that yet with the new 1.1 drivers. I'm also going to check out Pro Tools 2018 on the Surface and let you know all about that. And I have a ridiculously ambitious plan for March, which I'll tell you all about in another video in a week or two. But just to give you a glimmer, is the idea of making March kind of the Molten modular music making month, where we, or at least I, commit to like making a new track every other day through the whole of March. Just like that, just make it happen. Just make making music actually occur. I mean, it's kind of inspired by, during February, there's a February album writing month thing, I think, which is a bit of a thing. People sign up to it. And I was kind of planning to do that, but I ran out of time and couldn't really feel like I could get my act together enough. But March, that gives me a few weeks just to prepare myself, to really work with my rack to see if I can get it into a position where I could write music with it. And I'm talking about music and sort of songs, not just a patch, but maybe a patch is enough. I don't know. I'm still working on this in my head, and I'll do a video announcing it all about it and inviting everyone to get on board with the idea of doing this together. And then maybe we can put together a showcase of what we did. Something, just the motivation and the push needed to actually make music with this stuff. That would be great. And if you want to get involved, then use the hashtag So that's five M's, I think. Molten Modular Music Making Month. Or March is the month for music making modular. Or something like that. 5 M's. 5 M's and a hashtag. Let's call it that. That'll do. I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope that's given you a flavour of the NAMM show, or the stuff that's on offer and the things that are coming out and coming around soon. Do go and check out those video channels for more detailed explanations and introductions and demonstrations on all the products that I've talked about. And if you've liked this, please subscribe, please share it to other people. And if you're a bit more daring, come and visit my Patreon page and maybe throw me a couple of dollars. That would be excellent. And in the meantime, go and make some tunes.